Well, now to our next conversation. Well, political economists are of the view that economic development does not happen by accident in any country. Rather, it's a result of careful planning and efficient allocation of resources under a leadership that is committed to achieving that task. Well, Nigeria has enjoyed over 5 decades of political freedom, but how has this impacted development? Well, to weigh on this matter, we have Mr. Soji Apampa, co-founder, CEO of the Integrity Organization Limited. Happy New Year, sir, and great to have you on the program.
And the same to you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So, 2021 was a challenging year for global economies, COVID-19, inflation, and other headwinds. How would you describe performance of leadership in the past year as regards economic performance?
Well, I think the only way to look at economic performance is looking at the impact on the ordinary person. I think the prices of most things have gone up. What used to cost 30 naira before is now costing up to 67, 70% more than that. So in terms of how people feel, I think people feel worse off. And that is the economic climate that we're in at the moment.
Chinua Achebe, in one of his books, said the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. Do you agree?
I totally agree. I think Chinua Achebe, in his usual form, is spot on. And the reason for this is that the direction in which the whole country is going is charted by leadership. The policies that are adopted are proposed by leadership. The implementation or the failure to implement those policies effectively is done and supervised by leadership. So if you continue to feel adverse effects in the political arena or economic or social, in whatever arena it is, then it flows back to the leadership. However, we shouldn't keep thinking of leadership only in terms of people who are elected to office. After all, we're all leaders where we are, whether we're in the private sector or public sector, we're all leaders. So we should think of Chinua Achebe's statement much broader than just political leadership. Because if you look at the behavior of people on the roads, the refusal to queue up and so on, that is also a leadership choice at that material time. So I think the failure of leadership is what is showing through all strata of life in Nigeria at the moment.
Right, but surely we can't all be leaders. Talking about public office. So what can we do to address this trouble with Nigeria?
It's true we can't all be leaders, but there's the saying, the simple definition of leadership is example. Example is leadership. So once you choose to behave a certain way and others follow you, you are a leader. So I think private citizens, private companies, other than those who are elected into office, also have a role in leadership. Take, for example, somebody pulls out of an orderly queue and beats the traffic lights. You will find many other people who will follow. That is example, and it's more powerful. It's a very powerful form of leadership. So what we can do is to choose the behaviors that build integrity. For example, we need to say when things are not working. Even just simply speaking up that something isn't working and needs to be fixed. If enough of us speak up about it, that is a different form of leadership, but it's the kind of leadership that shows a demand for a policy or a change in policy that the policymakers will find very difficult to ignore. So we also the led, in quotes, need to be able to demonstrate a level of leadership in order to deal with the trouble with Nigeria.
All right, talking about, private citizens and, the private sector, demonstrating leadership, but are we relying on just the few at the helm of affairs, in the public sector to actually change the narrative in Nigeria?
Okay, let me give you an example where this has actually worked. In 2011, the UK Bribery Act was put into place. And the year after, in 2012, after it came into force, in the maritime sector, most of the CEOs there came together and formed what is called the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. And the first thing they did was to approach the government of Nigeria, because that UK Bribery Act says failure to prevent bribery is an offense. So for the first time, it became an offense if you failed to prevent bribery. So they were afraid of what will happen if their vessels and their shipmasters came to Nigeria and bribed a public official in Nigeria. They will be liable back home. So they wrote to the presidency and asked the presidency to join with them to do something about the levels of corruption. To cut a long story short, the presidency at the time agreed, and they have been working together with the private sector leading the charge and improving the environment for vessel clearance in Nigeria. To the extent that Nigeria is seen somewhat as an example. And remember, I said example is leadership. So Nigeria is now beginning to show some leadership because of the collective action between the private sector and the public sector. So yes, the public sector is still responsible for implementing some of these things, but the imagination, the vision of what is possible, and the paths and the options that could be taken, sometimes you need the private sector and private citizens to actually show that example and show what could be before you can get the public sector. So it's not the public sector alone, it's everyone together that are working collectively in order to make this work.
All right, and leadership shown by affected groups on key public service issues, and addressed by dedicated public servants is quite admirable. But how much impact can this achieve?
Well, if you permit me to just stay on the example of the maritime sector that I mentioned, in terms of achievement, what the ship masters did in 2019 was to complain about the demands for large cash payments from public officials. There were 266 such demands that were reported. But by 2020, and with the actions that the government took in partnership with the private sector, this fell to 128 complaints. And by 2021, there were only 51 or so such reports. So you can see that year on year, the levels of demands for such large cash payments reduced drastically, simply because the private sector took a level of leadership, and the public sector itself responded with the kind of leadership that was required to keep these things under control. So there is a great impact that could come out of either private citizens with one voice or the private sector with one voice speaking about an issue. So those who are beneficiaries of services from government or anything provided by government should understand that it is their leadership responsibility to give feedback and to stay with it and to follow through until those things are repaired. So at least this is the kind of impact that we have seen occur over the years in the maritime sector.
quite interesting, what's happening in that sector. But do you envisage a situation in which, Nigeria as a nation might begin to show leadership to the rest of the world, or is this too much of a stretch of the concept?
Well, I'm happy to report that in this sequence of things that I've been talking about, for example, in the maritime sector since 2012, it has gotten to a stage now that other countries have noticed. Ghana noticed, and they got in touch with Nigeria Shippers Council, and they made a visit to Nigeria to look at some of the things going on here. I'm also happy to note that Ukraine is understudying what Nigeria is doing, and they're also now trying to improve their maritime sector based on what Nigeria is doing. Egypt also started about mid-year last year, and India is starting this January. So if we stay with the idea that example is leadership, Nigeria is beginning to show a different kind of example than the one it was known for. And it's also good to note that these are the sorts of business people who get surveyed by Transparency International annually to feel their pulse on the ease of doing business and what it means, what levels of corruption there is in doing business with Nigerian officials and so on. So it wouldn't be surprising if in a couple of years we start to see improved figures coming from this if Nigeria keeps this sort of responsiveness, if it keeps it up and keeps it going. So I think that Nigeria is an example here. Also in the entertainment industry, we know that Nigeria is the example. You go to Terminal 5 in the UK, it's Nigerian music being played. If it's Nollywood, you know Nigeria is also setting the pace and making an example in sports as well. Even in football, the sort of footballers that we're exporting. So in many ways, Nigeria is actually showing leadership. We just need to change the narrative. We need to speak about these things that we're doing and get people to do more of it so that Nigerians choose the path of integrity over the path of corruption. And that will help us take our pride of place amongst the Committee of Nations.
Right. I guess we all have a role to play in all of this. All right, Mr. Papa, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program. Mr. Shoja Papa is a co-founder and CEO at the Integrity Organization Limited, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you.
All right, now, after the break, we head on to the markets. That's the moment. Do stay with us. This is Business Morning.